This roundtable has been organised by the Humanities Sustainability Research Project. The project is housed in the Centre for Public Humanities at Portland State, and this roundtable is called Eating Animals. And taken on its own, this phrase could mean at least two things. First of all, it could refer to animals who eat, or animals that eat. In this sense, my cat Mojo is an eating animal. In this sense, I'm an eating animal as well. And in this first sense, as a title for an event, you might think that eating animals is falsely advertising what's going to happen tonight, because we're not going to be exhibiting different kinds of eating animals. This isn't going to be a practical demonstration. We're not going to be looking at different animals engaged in the act of eating in any way. But of course, there are animals in this room who do eat, right? But they won't be eating right now. I think we have some animal crackers up here, which is. But in fact, most of tonight will feature animals that can eat, but for now we'll refrain from eating for the most part, and we'll be talking instead. And these animals are, of course, our participants, but also our audience, you guys. But the second sense of eating animals, the second meaning that it can have, and perhaps more obviously, is just the practice of eating animals. We might even say there are two different kinds of animals: animals who eat and animals who are eaten. So let's say eating animals and eaten animals. And I think the real challenge the phrase gives us is how to think these two things together. So how do we talk about eating animals, right? And I think hopefully tonight our talk will take in both the nature of being eating animals and the act of eating animals as well. And weaving both of these two senses of eating animals together, one way to locate the theme of eating animals is within the growing public discussion about the production, preparation, consumption of food. And I think of the works that are contributing to this public discussion, Michael Pollan's work is perhaps the most well known. And I think we'd all agree that we're not just animals who can eat, but animals who must eat, and moreover animals who must eat well. But the really interesting issues, I think, begin when we ask, okay, how do we eat well? And it looks like a simple question, but it's actually massive, right? So we can make the issue we're going to discuss tonight a bit more modest by simply asking, how can we eat animals well, if at all? Of course, even within this focus, things aren't quite so simple, because even this question encompasses agriculture, nutrition, gastronomy, ecology, ethics, law, culture, economics. In other words, the issues that animate the phrase eating animals link together both eating on the one hand and talking in really essential ways. I mean, as soon as we ask how can we eat animals well, if at all, we immediately acknowledge that we don't eat any animals in any situation in any way for any reason. How we eat animals and whether we eat animals is inextricably interwoven with the way that we talk about eating animals. And so the challenge of tonight's roundtable is not just to talk about eating animals, but also to talk about how we talk about eating animals. Ramona Ilea is an assistant professor of philosophy at Pacific University here in Portland. In her teaching and research, she practices a form of philosophy which is actively engaged in real-world issues. She teaches course into scholarship in environmental ethics, in animal ethics, and also in the ethical issues thrown up in medicine, in biotechnology, and in disability.
The topic for tonight is eating animals, and I was just wondering if you guys have any idea what people like me, philosophers, have been talking about animals. How long have we been talking about animals? Any idea? Like for a half hour? Forever. Well, I don't know if there were philosophers since the beginning of time, but okay, maybe forever. Since the Greeks. Any other guesses? God, you guys are good. I was supposed to be a surprise. You were supposed to say, oh, like it's a 20th century, 21st century issue, right? That's what a lot of people think. So, but it's great. You basically got the right answer, right? We've been talking about it for a very, very long time, at least 2,500 years. So how many of you, this is my second question, and I promise not to ask you questions all throughout my talk, but how many of you have heard of Pythagoras? Wow. Okay, great. And where did you hear about him? In what context? What was he? Math, geometry, right? So good. Pretty much everybody seems to have heard about him, I think, from math, trigonometry, geometry, high school, whatever, you know, high school math class and that sort of thing. So Pythagoras is well known for being a mathematician, but he was also the first philosopher, some people say. He was the first one to call himself a philosopher. And by that, he meant a lover of wisdom. So philosophy, if you look at the word philosophy, it means philosophy, so that's love, of Sophia, wisdom, right? So philosophers are lovers of wisdom. And Pythagoras, the first philosopher, was vegetarian. And the weird thing about that, in some ways, that strikes some people as being weird, is that he lived 2,500 years ago. Right? So that's a really long time ago, and he talked about vegetarianism and reasons for being vegetarian, and he had a whole school of thought, a bunch of people that followed him around, and there were philosophers, wannabe philosophers, and there were vegetarians. And this was so long ago. And then since then, for the past 2,500 years, philosophers have been talking about eating animals, this topic, right? In all kinds of different ways. So Aristotle, a well-known Greek philosopher, talked about eating animals. Aristotle wasn't the only one to talk about eating animals and about the moral status of animals. Aquinas, philosopher in the 1300s, talked about animals. Since then, René Descartes, Voltaire, Tolstoy, Bentham, John Stuart Mill. These are really well-known philosophers, big names in philosophy. What do they talk about? All kinds of different things, but also the moral status of animals. So usually I teach a semester-long class on the moral status of animals at Pacific University, which is in Forest Grove. And tonight I'm going to try to boil all that down into probably, I have like 13 minutes left, right? So we're going to try here. All right, so let me start with a well-known belief, which is that when people talk about animal rights, we're actually talking about animals having rights. Okay? So the idea is that animal rights refers to animals having rights. That makes sense, right? That's the phrase. That's what the phrase implies. But actually, that's not what a lot of people believe. But some people do. So some people think that animals have rights. So the most well-known person who believes that is Tom Regan, who's seen as the founder, the philosophical founder of animal rights. So what Tom Regan believes, and what a lot of people who believe in animal rights think, in animal rights per se, like actual rights, is that animals have negative rights. Negative rights are rights against bodily interference. So if I have negative rights, it means leave me alone, right? It doesn't mean you have to provide for me. It means you should leave me alone. So don't kill me. Don't touch me. Don't cut off my ears. Don't cut off my nose. Don't rape me. That kind of thing, right? So the right to life can be seen as a negative right, and the right to bodily integrity is a negative right, right? So a lot of people think that humans have rights, have these rights at least, right? The right to positive rights, like the right to health care, the right to education, are very controversial, right? A lot of people debate those. Do we really have the right to education? Do we really have the right to health care? I don't know. But a lot of people think we at least have the right not to be killed. We at least have the right not to be raped, right? Or have our ears cut off, our eyes poked out, right? So similarly, Regan says, who knows about animals having positive rights, but they have negative rights at least. So they have the right not to be killed. They have the right not to be castrated without anesthesia, as pigs often are. They have the right not to have their beaks cut off, as chickens are, routinely. This is commonly done in both factory farms, where 98 to 99% of egg-laying hens come from, of of eggs. So when you look at eggs in this cafeteria, at the supermarket, and so on, most of the time those come from factory farms. And those the hens' beaks are cut off. I mean, not the whole beak, but the tip of the beak. But also in free range, so-called free range places, cage-free, certified cage-free, which is something that even the Humane Society of the United States tries to advocate for a little bit, tries to include those into schools and so on. Those are better for the hens, but their beaks are still trimmed, if you want to be nice, but the practice is often called debeaking, right? So Reagan says that is just not okay, right? Animals have the right to bodily integrity, to be at least left alone, to have their bodies intact, right? Not to have parts chopped off. And they have the right not to be killed. And of course, eating animals involves killing animals, right? In some way or another, unless you're eating roadkill or something that died already, right? So we might not kill the animal directly, but it involves eating dead animals. Very few people are into eating live animals, and very few people eat live animals regularly, right, on a normal basis. So Reagan would definitely be against eating animals of any sort, but he's also against eating animal products such as eggs, such as milk, cheese, all that stuff. And the reasons for that are a little bit more complicated, but in the end, animals are raised for a very short period of time and for their products, right, for their eggs, for their milk, and so on, and then eventually killed when they stop being productive. And animals raised for food don't usually live their whole lifespan because it starts to be inefficient to raise them, so they're killed at an early age. If you look at actually the normal lifespan of animals, we kill them at such an early age that we could be saying we're eating babies, basically. Right? They're all kind of babies or, you know, toddlers or infants or whatever. So pretty much that violates the right to life, seen negatively, right? The negative right to life. Does that make sense? Okay, good. So you might think, well, this whole talk of rights makes me uneasy. What are these rights? Who gives them to us and so on? You might not be really into rights, but you might think of yourself as being an animal-friendly person. In that case, you might be more sympathetic to the second kind of theories that I'm going to talk about. And this is, I think, the best proponent of this kind of theory, the one that I'm going to start talking about now, is Peter Singer. How many of you have heard of Peter Singer before? Ooh, look at that. This is awesome. So Singer is seen as the founder of the animal rights movement. So not the philosophy of animal rights, but the animal rights movement, the modern animal rights movement. And his book, Animal Liberation, which pretty much every library has, you can find on Amazon for like really cheap, and secondhand copies are everywhere. The book Animal Liberation is seen as the Bible of the animal rights movement. So you think, wow, somebody who's the founder of the animal rights movement, somebody who wrote the Bible of the animal rights movement, must believe in animal rights, right? I mean, how could he not? But he doesn't, and he never did. So his argument is really different. Peter Singer believes, and a lot of people with him believe, that animals don't necessarily have rights. Instead, and he doesn't believe that necessarily people have rights. He's suspicious of this whole idea of rights. So instead, he says what we should do is minimize suffering and maximize happiness or well-being, right? So what we need to look is at the totality of suffering and well-being and pick those options that maximize well-being over suffering. So when you're considering doing something, for example, you might think this lecture thing is kind of boring, not really what you signed up for. And you might decide to spice it up a little bit by talking to each other while I'm drinking my water. I'm a little bit turned away. And you talk to each other and you figure out that might make it much more exciting if you poke me in the eye. Right? So you take off my glasses, somebody holds me down, and you shove a pen in my eye, right? And why would you do that? Well, to spice things up, right? So see, I'm Romanian and Canadian. I have like multiple citizenships. So you might be curious, right? If that was part of the introduction, you might be curious. Is she going to scream out in Romanian or with a Canadian accent? I lived in Minnesota too, you know, maybe a Minnesotan accent. You might have scientific inclinations, right? Is the eye going to come out whole? Is it going to go inwards, right? Is there a lot of blood involved, right? Plus, it would be way more fun than listening to like the history of philosophy, right, in 12 minutes or less. So it seems like there's so many of you, gosh, I don't even know how many there are, but it's a lot more than I'm used to in my little tiny liberal arts college classes. So it's a lot of you and just one of me. So would people like Peter Singer, which are called utilitarians, tell us to do this horrible thing, right? Which I think is horrible. You might think it's fun. But would he tell us to do it? Because it's more pleasure, right? All this pleasure, a tiny little bit of pleasure, but add it up, versus my suffering. It might seem that way, but he would say, no, we shouldn't do that, right? Because it's our pleasure and happiness that counts, right, and our suffering, but also long term, right? We have to look at long term, and we have to look at the rest of society as well. So in the case of, and we have to look at the degree, the amount of suffering and pleasure involved. So when you poke me in the eye, you might get a little jolt of excitement, right? Something kind of cool happened, right? And something to tell your friends about. But your friends might not be thrilled. In fact, your girlfriend might break up with you when she hears that you poked some woman's eyes out, right? And PSU is going to get some negative publicity, right? Maybe donations are going to go down, tuition's going to increase, it's already increasing everywhere. This is not a good thing, right? Other philosophers are going to be scared. Other wannabe philosophers in grad school struggling away are going to hear about this. Has multiple negative consequences, right? Plus my suffering. I mean, I would suffer not just like at the moment, right, which would be pretty horrible, but forever, right, for the next who knows how many years I have left, right? And I would suffer quite a bit, right, in multiple ways. So that matters, right? The amount of suffering matters. So when we look at something like animals, well, actually, I'm jumping ahead, but whose suffering matters? It so happens that all of us here might be animals, as was mentioned in the introduction, but we're human animals, right? So we can kind of safely assume that our suffering matters and our happiness matters. But what about those animals like those, rats, and pigs and cows and those, feathery chickens with their beady eyes and their little beaks, Do those matter? Do they really matter, right? Singer says, yeah, they really matter. Why do they matter? Because they can feel pain, right? And that's all we need to know. So if E.T. comes along with his weird bodily head, we might say, wow, what a cute little thing, right? I want to put it in the laundry machine and clean it up. Should you do that? Like a dirty teddy bear you find on the road. Well, it depends. It depends if E.T. can feel pain or not. If E.T. can feel pain, putting him in the laundry machine is not going to be a very nice thing to do, right? If E.T. can't, if he's really just a stuffed toy, like a machinery or really just a cute little fuzzy thing, that you can wash and then play with, sure, like a teddy bear. Why not wash it, right? Similarly, could poke E.T.'s eyes out? It depends. Can E.T. feel pain or not? With dogs and cats, I bet if I said, give me your dog right now, I'll poke his eyes out. Because I like doing that kind of thing. You'd be like, wow, that is just weird, right? But you would keep your dog away from me, and if your kid is developing, your kid is only like 4 years old, and he likes beating up the dog, you'd say, don't do that, don't beat up the dog, don't pull on your cat's tail, right? Don't hit them over the head, because you think, probably that most people think cats and dogs can feel pain. Similarly, cows and pigs can feel pain. So it's that simple, really, for Singer. Can they feel pain? If they can, their suffering counts, right? So if I get pleasure out of poking an animal's eyes out, then I shouldn't really do that because their suffering counts and my pleasure counts, but overall it's not a good balance. When you look at something like eating animals, right, which is today's topic, then we have to look at the number of animals that are suffering, right, and the number of animals that get pleasure out of eating the animals, and the amount of suffering. So with eating animals, Americans eat an average of, guess how many animals a year? Come on.
All of us? Or per capita?
No, per person. Per person. 30. 50. 1, did you say?
0.
0. America on average eats 0 animals. You wish. You're living in La La Land.
In 5 years.
Okay. We'll talk. Do you want to bet? We'll bet $100. No, we'll bet $10,000. And you owe it to me. We have witnesses. So she thinks in 5 years, 0 animals, but I don't think so. So how many do you think now? We have 30, 50, other guesses? 0?
60.
60? 200. Ooh. Okay, it's about 83, more or less, right? So when you look at the amount of suffering, 83 animals for me, right? Just one person, and 83 of them. And that's just per year. If I live for only 10 years, and I've already lived for 34, right? If I only live for 10 more years, that's 830 animals. But do they suffer? Well, it depends on what you're eating, right? But if you're eating normal animals that are sold in most places, right, that come from factory farms, they're suffering a great deal. And I'm not going to put up pictures and give you guys horrible videos and too many stories, but it's a lot of suffering, right? I already mentioned 2 of the common practices, babies taking away from them, all kinds of nasty things. But also, again, free range, cage-free, blah, blah, all that stuff. You know, there's a lot of suffering involved in those as well, in the slaughter process and so on. So there's a lot of suffering, and there are a lot of them. And meanwhile, it's just me. And how important is eating meat to me in my life? I mean, everything in my life. I have friends, I have a partner, I have an apartment, I have a job, you know, I like eating chocolate too, I like, you know, all kinds of things in my life. So in comparison, eating meat might be very important, but it's not that important. It's not as important as friendship is to me, let's say, right? Not as important as having a good job, being healthy. So overall, right, it's a lot of suffering and just some pleasure for one person. So Singer says don't eat animals. Don't eat animal products. They're both vegan, right? So a third view, and I don't have much time to go into it, is a view that is attributed to Immanuel Kant, who lived in the 1700s, but it's still very, very popular today. And I would bet you it's very popular. If we go outside and take a survey, it would be maybe the most popular of the 3. And that's the belief that we have only indirect duties to animals. So in the case of poking the dog in the eye, we're not harming the dog. We're harming humanity. Because if your kid likes to torture dogs, you might be worried about the dog, but Kant was not worried about the dog. Kant was worried that the kid might develop into a psychopath or into just a bad, mean person. And there is evidence that shows that, not for kids, because kids experiment in all kinds of ways, but adults that torture animals, psychopaths that torture animals, move on and torture kids, then move on and torture women, and then men. It's that kind of progression, right? So then we might be worried, and that's one of the reasons why we might want to pass laws against animal cruelty, kind of nip it in the butt, right? So when people are torturing animals, then we say, psh, bad, don't do that kind of thing, right? We're worried about you. What kind of citizen are you, right? But not because we're worried about those animals, but we're worried about humanity. With eating animals, then the question becomes, are we hurting humanity by eating them? And a lot of people say, not really, right? They taste good. They have lots of calories, lots of protein. You know, it's a tradition. There are lots of dishes I wouldn't be able to eat as easily, right? So humans get something out of it. So the indirect duty might say it's okay to eat animals. Or the indirect duty view would say it's not okay to eat animals because of indirect reasons, environmental reasons, right? And that's something that the next speaker is going to talk more about, but something like the UN report that got published recently. It's a 400-so page report, Livestock's Long Shadow, published by the United Nations, not PETA or, you know, whoever, shows that livestock is responsible for a lot more greenhouse gas emissions than transport, than all of transport, right? So you think environmentalists are worried about SUVs and flying and so on. All the ships, the planes, the SUVs, the cars, everything in the world, all of those things together emit less greenhouse gases than the livestock industry. right? And that's the United Nations saying it, and they have proof, right? You can read it. It's 400 pages of proof, right? Tons of proof, right? And there are many, many, many such studies published by very reputable sources. What kind of argument, though, is that for vegetarianism? It's an indirect duty argument. It's not because of the animals, but because of the environment. And the environment, if the environment gets screwed up, then we're going to be screwed up, right? So that's an indirect duty view. Some people make health arguments. I'm not going to make those tonight, but those, again, if you want to be vegetarian or eat humanely raised meat or whatever it's called, for health reasons, it's about humans. It's not about the animals, right? So it's good to be attuned to these kinds of arguments when you hear them. Is it rights? Is it suffering? Or is it really all about the humans? Right? So there are kind of three camps, and that's all I kind of wanted to lay out for you guys here in 15 minutes. And then the next speakers are going to take it from there and give you different kinds of arguments that are really exciting and interesting, and you'll have questions for us, hopefully.
Cathy Hissler is director and professor of the Animal Law Clinic, which itself is part of the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School. And her work takes up issues in animal law, free speech, clinical legal education, mediation, and the legal implications of protest. And her new book, Animal Law in a Nutshell, which is co-authored with Pamela Fresh, is coming out this year.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Professor Ilea. So we have a lot to talk about, and we don't have a lot of time. I want to let you know what my perspective is coming into this conversation. So I'm a lawyer, and so that affects my perspective, for good or bad. And so I can talk to you a little bit about rights in just a minute. I also come at this conversation from the perspective that the animal movement is a social justice movement, and it's helpful to look at it in that way. And so that you know, I've been a vegan for about 22 years, so I have that perspective as well. And I think it's useful to know where people come from so you can judge what I'm saying and filter it through your own perspectives. So because this is my perspective, the question that I ask, I believe that the questions we ask ourselves sort of guide the answers, right? What the possible answers are limited by the questions that we ask ourselves. So the question that I ask myself is whether it's right, not right in the legal sense, but whether it's correct to eat animals, okay? Excuse me. Okay. So we know that this has been a conversation that's been going on for a long time, and it's not always one that's carried on in a very civil manner. And so it's delightful that we're having civil discourse today. And there's a legion of examples about the difficulty going back very, very far. And so we have the wonderful Greek mythology and the Greek writings about something called the Golden Age. And in the Golden Age, they had this ideal society. And the concept was that it was a matriarchal society, and it was a society without war or violence, and it was a vegan society. And it's such an interesting concept, whether or not this time existed in reality, that this was the ideal that the Greeks thought everybody should strive for, right? And that's a really, really interesting concept that took place a long time ago. And this is in the midst of a very bloody sort of, time in history where there are all this internecine warfare all over the globe. We also have, fast forward, we have things like Catholic vegetarians were considered heretics in the 1200s and force-fed meat. Now, how this was against the religion, I'm not quite sure. But there are lots of examples about people having a very difficult time sort of accepting this as a concept and sort of living and let live, right? Letting other people make their decisions. So that's what we're trying to do right now. The question is how to frame the conversation. So there are a lot of different ways. I want to pick up on a couple of points that Professor Ilea talked about. So it's wonderful to have the philosophical underpinnings first, because that really is the foundation of some of the legal consequences, right? Because law has to sit on something. There has to be a basis. There has to be evidence, right? That's what we do. You have to prove your case, and you have to have facts and evidence, right? So why do we go forward one way or another with respect to animals and rights in this conversation? This is a very difficult conversation, and the law is struggling with it. And so we have some philosophical underpinnings that we can look to, because until recently, we haven't had very many scientific underpinnings, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But when the philosophers talk about rights, they are just as Professor Ilea discussed. When lawyers talk about rights, it's quite different, okay? When I talk with my law students about rights, when they talk about animal rights, they want, do animals have rights? Do they actually have rights? That's the question they're interested in. And I'm here to tell you, no matter what anyone else thinks or says, animals do not have rights. Not a single animal in this country has a single right, okay? Doesn't happen, not yet. Now, Professor Reagan and Singer may think that they are due, right, that they have rights which are worthy of being respected and recognized, but they don't have legal rights, cognizable rights in this country. What we do have are rights that humans have that they can exercise on behalf of animals. So how many people here have companion animals, animals that live with them? All right. So if someone, kicks your dog or a cat, right, you can take them to court, right? The state, in the way that Professor Ilea was talking, has an interest in curbing bad behavior. Okay, so they can be prosecuted, but the animal has no right. You, as the owner of the animal, have a right to sue that person independently in civil court, okay, and try and get damages. You have that right. The animal has no rights. All right? Now, people are thinking about how to reorient this and whether rights can be posited in the body of animal, right? And have guardians somehow responsible for exercising and protecting those rights, just in the same way that we do for children or people who are not competent, for instance, right? So children have rights, but they can't go to court. They can't enforce those rights. But they are posited in the children, and then a guardian would speak for them, would protect them, would enforce those rights. But we're not there yet with respect to animals, okay? Now, the very interesting thing about this, when we talk about this in the legal context, people are like, of course animals don't have rights. It's the craziest thing in the world. Why should animals have rights? And then we have conversations about how they suffer, how they feel, how they have cognition, how they have self-awareness, and we have more and more information scientifically these days about the bases upon which we could give them rights, okay? So it used to be, the philosophers would say, the division between the animal kingdom, the rest of the animal kingdom, and the human animal kingdom are that they can't suffer, or they can't think, or they don't live in family groups. They don't understand this or that, right? They're not self-aware. They can't think. And each one of the things scientists have said separate us from other animals has been disputed and then knocked down pretty much, right? So we pretty much understand, I mean, even fish, the research on fish these days is phenomenal about, like, they even understand time and place and all kinds of very interesting things. So where does that leave us? Well, the legal philosophers would say, you have to have a justification for giving rights. And we don't really have it yet. We haven't accepted it. It's not a cultural norm widespread enough to give credence to it, so we're not going to go there. And yet, we have from the Massachusetts Bay Colonies, the oldest anti-cruelty statute in the world, and dates back to the 1600s. And the really curious question is, okay, so I can't kick your dog, right? It's against the law, has been pretty much every jurisdiction and province in this country from the beginning. I can kick your book, and it's not the same kind of problem. All right? So if an animal is property, which an animal is, every animal is property in this country and around the world, right? And is reduced to ownership by humans, right? So the humans control the fate of the animals, even wildlife. Why do we distinguish? Why is it against the law, right, to hurt an animal and not hurt a book, right? Why is it assault, right? Why is it cruelty? Why do we make these distinctions? And so inherently, we understand that there is a distinction. My book cannot suffer, right? I can hit it, I can destroy it, I can tear it up, and if it's my book, nobody cares. But I can't do that to my dog or my cat. That's against the law, okay? And that distinction surfaces the tension that we have in the law between sort of the cultural reality, right, and sort of the legal reality, okay? So let's build on that a tiny bit. Why do we have some of this distinction? Well, we have another philosopher, Descartes. And Descartes is a very interesting person, and what we get from him with respect to the question about animals is that we can pull apart. Animals were animistic, right? They were like machines. They didn't have feelings. They couldn't suffer. You could sort of take them apart, right, and look at them, see how they worked, and you really didn't have to worry about any suffering, right? So that leads to all kinds of conceptions and all kinds of sort of industry related to animals. So animal testing then is a really sensible thing if you believe in the Cartesian principles, right? So Descartes was a pretty common source of scientific approach, right, in thinking about animals for a very long time. Then we have Darwin, right, and Darwin shifts the approach pretty significantly and says, you know what, there's an animal kingdom or queendom, right, that animals we're all part of this system, and they are like us and we are like them. And more, we know that to be true, right? We know that I think it's 99 point something percent of the DNA we have in common with even a fruit fly, which is kind of scary and weird, but okay, right? We're learning more about how we are like them and they're like us. And the distinctions that we sought to use to justify treating them differently than us are without basis, okay? All right, so where does that take us? So let me talk really quickly about the law as it relates to animals who are bred for food in this country right now, because a lot of people don't really know this. So really quickly, there are no federal laws that protect animals being raised for food, about conditions, about anything, okay? There's no federal law in this country that speaks to how animals must be raised, none, okay? Not a one. The only federal legislation that we have with respect to food animals are pretty sort of bizarre. So we have one during transport. If you're going to transport animals longer than 28 hours, then that you have to, at that point, stop and give them food and water and maybe some shelter. Rest them, they can put them back on the truck. And then the other part is slaughter, right? So you have to humanely slaughter animals, except if you're doing ritual slaughter, so kosher or halal. And neither of those statutes apply to poultry, okay? So the animals who are slaughtered in the greatest numbers are excluded from what little protection actually exists in the federal regime, okay? That's the federal system, pretty bleak, right? And I think the sad thing is most people assume the federal government's on top of this, right? That they're regulating it, that there's some control. Yeah, it just doesn't happen. Okay. At the state level, states are beginning to work on this, right? And there's some small protections that are being given to animals in the food, being raised for food context, okay? So we have 7 states now that ban gestation crates, and you guys seem like a pretty sophisticated audience, so I assume you know what I'm talking about, and if not, just say, what is that? 5 states that ban veal crates, 2 states that ban battery cages, and 1 state, California, just banned tail docking, okay? And again, that's it. That's it. And those were done by initiative, by voters. They weren't usually done by the legislature, sort of as a top-down, including in some of those statutes are some affirmative protections as well, that they have to have, the animals have to have enough room to turn around and to sit down. So those are the protections animals have in the factory context, and really we're talking primarily about the factory farming context because that's where most of the food animals come from, but this applies to any farming context, right? So there's no regulation for any context. So, all right, so we have some fundamental questions. The question is, what should the role of law be in regulating animals that are being raised and slaughtered for food, right? Is this something we should not regulate? Is this something we should regulate? We know, and we could go on, certainly all of us could talk about the human health issues and the environmental health issues, and we don't have enough time to sort of get into all of that, the worker safety issues and obviously animal welfare. So the question is, not getting into all those details, but knowing what you already know, should the law regulate, and if so, how, and how do we want them to do that? So right now, merging the couple of questions together, do we have a legal right to eat animals? Getting to the crux of what we're here to talk about. Yes, right? We have a legal right to eat animals. That's pretty clear. Do we have a moral right to eat animals? That's, more questionable, and it's partly going to depend on the place you come from with your moral philosophy. Are you a Kantian, right? Do you follow Reagan or Singer or Descartes? And then that will help us know how you feel about that, right? So I'm going to take you just through a logical approach. So we have the legal approach, we have the moral philosophy approach, and let's just follow a logical approach, which blends a little of the two for a minute. Okay, and I'm going to ask for audience participation. So I'm going to ask for how much support there is for these propositions. So for the proposition that we are members of the animal kingdom or queendom, how many people agree with that? Great, okay. That we have a right ourselves to survive. Yeah? Okay. And that eating is a part of that right of survival. Okay? That we shouldn't cause unnecessary suffering. All right? That animals can suffer. Okay? That animals do suffer in the process of being raised and killed for food. okay? And that we don't need to eat animals to live healthful lives. Okay, so the proposition that would lead me to is that killing animals for food that we don't require for survival is unnecessary suffering and is therefore without moral or logical authority. Okay, so that's where I end up. Obviously, there are suppositions that not everybody buys into. So let me look at it really quickly. One other thing, because I think this is helpful. When we talk about food animals, we really talk about them like they're very distinct from other animals. And it's just useful to remind yourself. So how many people, we already ascertained lots of people have companion animals. How many people in the room eat meat? Okay. How many people would consider eating the animals they live with for meat? A couple people, all right. Wasn't sure how that would go. Okay, but not so many. And this raises, again, a tension, right? The distinction with, if we're not going to eat our dogs, by and large, right, in this country, because we have cultural or other traditions that would indicate that that's not something we do in this country, why? Why do we eat cows and not dogs, right? Why do we eat chickens and not cats? There's nothing inherently different between those species. There's no scientific reason for distinguishing between them. And if one species deserves your protection, then why not the other, right? So it raises a question that we have to answer for ourselves.
Third, I think normally a food writer, Camas Davis organized Livestock near the end of last year. That was part of the literary festival Wordstock. And in quite a unique way, Livestock brought together live butchery demonstrations and live readings of personal essays, so as I understand. Essays explored various dimensions of the practice of eating and not eating meat. And at the moment she's busy setting up the Portland Meat Collective, which is part community sustainable agriculture project and part traveling butchery school.
I'm not here exactly to argue for or against meat eating. What I'm going to do is look at a spectrum that exists right now in America and look at something in the middle of those two extremes of the spectrum. So if you have read Michael Pollan's book, something that he talks about is that we have two choices right now for the most part when it comes to eating animals. Some people choose not to eat animals at all. Some people choose to eat animals and look away. And by looking away, he's talking about choosing not to think about how we are complicit within the entire production system that meat is produced under in America, which means most of us who do eat meat and buy meat are not involved in the farming and production of animals. We're not involved in the slaughter of animals. We're usually not involved in the butchery of animals. So there's an entire process in the middle that we are choosing not to look at, not to be a part of. It's also kept from us in a lot of ways. So what I want to do is look at, on the one end we have not eating animals at all. On the other end we have eating animals, most of which what we're eating is produced in what I think most of us, and I'm just going to assume most of us in this room, would say is not necessarily the most appealing way for an animal to be raised, or not necessarily the best way for an animal to be raised if we do want to eat meat. So, and on that end of the spectrum we have CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations, which I'm going to just assume most of us are somewhat familiar with. We have cattle that are standing in their own manure for 160 days, cattle whose stomachs are not actually meant to eat corn, that are eating corn for the last part of their life. We have slaughterhouses where 400 cows or steer are killed in an hour, basically. So we're all, I think, to some extent aware of that extreme of meat eating versus not eating meat at all. So what lies in the middle? And this is something that I've been thinking about both because I began studying butchery in Europe this past summer, and saw a lot of different models about how to raise animals and how to create an alternative system to what we know in America. And also what lies in the middle in the sense of well, if there are some of us want to eat meat, but we don't want to eat meat that comes from that very extreme part of the spectrum in America, what are our choices? Do we have choices? Clearly, there's been a lot of discussion lately about small, in terms of smaller farms that have cropped up in America who are thinking about more local economies, who are thinking about, who are actually raising animals in a way that some might argue don't feel pain, don't suffer, who live as sort of their essential pigness or their essential cowness. The cows eat grass, which is what they're meant to do all their life. When they're killed for food, they're stunned, they're killed, there's no pain or suffering involved. So there are different ways of arguing about the pain and suffering of an animal. So I'm sort of going off a little bit here, but what I want to look at today is what, on a practical level, regulations exist that allow us to actually have some control over how those animals, if we choose to eat them, are raised, and that allow us to be a part of a more transparent system, which right now doesn't actually exist in America for the most part. So for the most part, any meat that's sold in America for commercial sale must be regulated by the USDA. So this means no matter how it's raised on a farm, once it's slaughtered, that has to be inspected by the USDA. When it's cut up and butchered and processed, that is a USDA inspected process. And then once it goes to a butcher shop, to some extent the USDA, or in some states, the state, are regulating how that meat is being sold, basically, and handled. This has meant over time that small farmers, small slaughterhouses can't actually afford to keep up with the USDA regulations. So what's happened is slaughterhouses, for instance, now have to, you have to pay for a lot of paperwork, you have to pay for inspectors to be there on site at all times. You have to follow very specific USDA regulations that were meant in the beginning to regulate large factory farms, basically, feedlots, CAFOs, that sort of thing. So where does the small farmer exist within that? Where, if I want to buy a pig from a small farmer directly, if I want to butcher my own pig, if I want to slaughter my own pig myself, if I want to kill my own pig, can I even do that? Is there even room for that within the USDA regulations? In fact, there is, and it's a law called the Custom Exempt Law. And this was, I think, I may be wrong, this was passed, I think after World War II, in order to allow for farmers who were selling lots of animals to factory farms, the onslaught of factory farms, to kill one pig a year, one cow a year, to use for their own personal use. This is the only law that exists that allows us to buy directly from a farm. And why is that? So if I, the consumer, want to buy from Bob the farmer a pig, and I say, I'm going to buy that live pig. I own that live pig, and therefore I'm going to use that for my personal use. No one's going to sell anything. No one, it's not going to be sold to my friends. It's not going to be sold to my family members. I'm just going to eat it throughout the year or whatnot. Technically, through the custom exempt law, I can do that. I can say, I own this animal that Bob raised. I bought it from him. Therefore, I can basically do whatever I want to do with it. So the USDA law, custom exempt law, allows for us as citizens to own a live animal, and says because we're not selling it, because it's not within this commercial context, we don't really have to go through those routes, those huge factory farm routes, those huge slaughterhouse routes. It means we can decide how it's slaughtered. We can slaughter it on the farm. which actually causes less stress to the animal than if it's shipped to a slaughterhouse 400 miles away, which is often the case. We can decide how to butcher it. So if I want to use the 48 French cuts that I learned this summer instead of the 12 basic cuts of meat that the U.S. does, I can do that myself. So that's the only way that any of us could sort of sit in the middle between not eating animals at all and buying meat that's raised, in my opinion, inhumanely, that causes suffering and that causes pain. And so what I've been doing in the past couple of months with the Portland Meat Collective is looking at, well, how can we create a local, some might call it an artisanal, some might call it a relational economy surrounding meat in which we as citizens can sort of divert around the way in which probably 90% of our meat is produced in America. And we say, we want to own that entire process from farm to table, which is a term that we've all probably heard in Portland. We want transparency. We want to probably eat less meat, buy a pig a year, buy a cow a year, that's it. We want to pay the money that it takes to actually go through that process, and that would define our sort of meat-eating selves. And so what's interesting is that as I've sort of in the past few months tried to form this, form the Portland Meat Collective, excuse me, every time I've talked to the USDA, they're not quite sure what to do with it. Their questions are, well, are you buying the animal yourself, or did you raise the animal? There's a lot of questions about what's my relation, if I buy through this custom exempt law, if I buy a pig through Farmer John, what is my true involvement with that animal, for instance? Or for instance, another question I've been asked is, well, if you're killing it yourself, who's watching you kill it? So the USDA has this law, but they don't actually know how to interpret it themselves. They don't actually know what it could really mean on a larger scale, basically. So for the Portland Meat Collective, I've been trying to approach that on a larger scale and see if it's possible to actually allow citizens who only want to eat meat if they know where it came from, if it comes from a farm in which, for instance, the cattle is only raised on grass, which is what cattle should be raised on, in my opinion, in which the slaughter happens on the farm, and in which the butchery happens either on your kitchen table or with someone you trust. I lost my train of thought. That is the only route in which we can eat meat in that fashion. So the question then becomes, how if something like the Portland Meat Collective became a model that could be that could be reproduced in other cities, would the USDA consider making that a law that wasn't so clandestine, that wasn't so under suspicion? Is that a model that's actually viable? Is it a model that could redefine what sustainability is, in a sense? So these are the kind of the questions I've been struggling with, and what's interesting to me is in a city like Portland, the people who are coming to the Portland Meat Collective and asking, how can I buy meat this way? A lot of them are actually vegetarians, which is interesting. A lot of them have been buying meat from places like New Seasons, which to some extent allows us to kind of feel as though we have some sense of where our meat comes from. But let's face it, just because we know the name of the farm and we know it's local doesn't mean anything necessarily. And so some people have said, I want to stop buying meat from even places like New Seasons, and I just want one pig from one farm for 1 year, each year, and I want to know exactly how it's raised. So the questions that are coming up for the people who are approaching the Portland Meat Collective are kind of interesting because it does require you to rethink your relationship to eating meat. It requires you to rethink your relationship to seasonality. You can't buy grass-fed beef all year round. It is more expensive to buy one pig from a farm under the custom exempt law, so maybe you only eat one pig a year. So these are kind of, I'm sort of scatterbrained a little bit, but these are the questions that I've been asking, and what's most interesting to me and what I'd love for you guys to comment on is how that could change our relationship to eating animals, and also how that could change our relationship to not eating animals in some ways.